Now, to talk a little bit more about myself, I think most of you obviously know me. I'm Rashab. I'm located in New York City, 25 years old. And when I think about who I am, I think the first thing I think about is being a spiritual being living a physical experience. And what I mean by that is everything in some way or form is like, for me at least, I analyze or I try to understand on a spiritual level, and then try to operate in the physical world, and use that grounding of that understanding of at my core who I am, which actually is a perpetual question that I reflect on, um, to try to drive purpose and what I want to accomplish from my life. So now maybe to get started, this first class today is meant to be very much a background class. The purpose of this right now is to talk about the how Hinduism kind of started. So this is kind of more historical in nature. There will be probably less discussion than the next classes will have. But the purpose of this is with understanding where Hinduism kind of originated from, what the term meant over a period of time, and all these other things. I think it gives us better context, and kind of gets away from the whole dogmatic approach of things where you kind of just like look at everything through one lens. Um, and that whole thing of like, I am correct, other people are not, which I think at its fundamental is like very against what Hindu principles stand for. So maybe to get started, can you guys still see my screen or no?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, amazing. That's good. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to start by talking about the Indus Valley Civilization. Now, the core thing for to note here through this entire, I guess, class is that studying history that goes as far back is difficult for a couple of reasons. There isn't very, very clear documentation. Studies are conducted in various ways and estimates, and people have very different opinions. And similar to, I think, in a scientific standpoint, there's theories that people have. So things are not necessarily definitive and are often proven wrong and so on. And this is also a very ancient time, right? 5,000 years ago. And the second, and I guess the final thing is there's always an element of, I guess you could say, mysticism that's mixed into history. And that's why understanding what exactly happened, what didn't happen, is a very interesting conversation, and people will always be on different sides of the spectrum. My goal is to just kind of provide a base level understanding. There may be things that I say that people disagree with, things that I might even be objectively wrong about, but the purpose is just to give a base level understanding of these. So to maybe get started, the Valley civilization was kind of modern day, a lot of Pakistan, the northern parts of India, up from Delhi, basically through Punjab, Himachal, Jammu and Kashmir, and going all the way down into Gujarat as well. Now this civilization was really interesting because they had urban planning. It was a proper civilization, and it wasn't like no like a nomadic lifestyle. They were core cities. I think Harappa is one of the big ones, and Mohenjo-daro is one of the other ones. And basically during this time there was a lot of diverse origins. So there were groups of people from Iran, from modern day Iran, I guess pre-farming of the Fertile Crescent, which is what that area is called. Ancestral populations that now are more like kind of more South Indian, for example, the Viridians, and then ancestral Indo-European populations like the Aryans. So there was kind of like this whole mix of populations, but there was a lot of cultural fluidity. Um, and that makes it a little bit hard to kind of distinguish these things as well. Now, the ancient scripts that they had at this time differ very differently from modern ones. Like there isn't a language in modern day that's very easily connected with what they had back then. And as a result, it's very difficult to translate things, and very hard to draw definitive conclusions. But there's some things that we kind of can understand. And in terms of the influence on Hindu thought, there's believed to be some ritualistic and symbolic influences. An example here is given over here. It's a pretty famous example, and even this is kind of like questionable in to some degree. There was believed to be this thing is called the Pashupati seal, which is this I think it's on like some carving of some sort that some people believe to be a proto deity that kind of evolved to be modern day Shiva. because you can see kind of this like meditative yogic stance. But then people are on various ends of the spectrum about that. So I'll let you decide based off of future renditions of Shiva and so on. Because it was an ancient society, a lot of it, there was definitely some elemental worship. So the five forces, earth, water, air, fire, and so on, ether. So there was elemental worship, and that was kind of what that civilization was like. Now, maybe transitioning over to the Vedic period. So after the fall or kind of like the slow ending of that civilization, we had the population start to move further in, and there were more Indo-Aryans that kind of came in. There are kind of two hypotheses over here in terms of what the migration was. One was that there was like a big Aryan migration slash invasion. Um, and then the second thing that there was just a gradual transformation of the civilization, and that the Indus Valley civilization just actually just kind of migrated and evolved into the Vedic civilization. But the thing to note over here is by this time there was drastically different language. So a very early version of Sanskrit was used. Sanskrit is, for context, an ancient language. It's actually still used in India, and it's often used for a lot of the prayers and things like that nowadays. But at that point, it was a spoken language. So an early version of that language existed. Um, and now in terms of characteristics, the rituals started to get more complex in nature, and there started to be more deity worship. So by deity, it's basically worshiping a certain aspect of creation. So an example being Indra. Indra is the lord of, I think, fire, of thunder, sorry, and so on. And that was actually something that was also aligned with Zoroastrian societies at that point. So that was something that is actually thought to have been brought over from that side. Um, the first core texts were also created around this time, the Vedas and the Upanishads. And I'll get into more detail of what that is, but that's the first core written texts that were created for Hindu thought. Now, the Varna system was also created, which is kind of the social hierarchy system based off of social and economic ability. This is what eventually evolved to become the caste system. But at this point, it was just more of some sort of social organizer, and people were allowed to switch based off of their abilities, based off of their natural skill set. So that was one thing that was really interesting. And the deity worship, as I mentioned, was based on natural forces. I believe this is an image from one of the early Vedic texts. It might be from one of the Vedas. Just an example of what the language looks for people that may not be familiar. Now, talking more about the actual texts. So the first and foremost prominent text that was written or was received was called the Vedas. And that was estimated historically to be written between 1500 and 1200 BC. But the interesting with this thing is we don't actually know when this was actually first compiled, because pre this era, a lot of things were passed down via oral transmission. So because it was passed down during oral transmission and there was no written records, how far back that oral transmission goes and when it was compiled or where it comes from is like very difficult in nature to kind of predict. So that's one thing that was really interesting. There are four Vedas. The first one is called the Rig Veda, and the Rig Veda is really interesting, because the Rig Veda itself has this. I'll give you an example of something. This was just something I found very cool, so I'm going to share it. But there's this one part of the Rig Veda called the Nasa Diya Sukta, or also known as the Hymn of Creation. So it's the Hindu understanding at that time of what creation was. And the interesting thing is that there's a lot of alignment between the viewpoint at that point in 1500 BC or however long before that it existed, of what creation was with modern Big Bang theory. So the belief system, and I'll actually send you guys a link, which will be a translation of the Nasadiya Sukta by someone, and kind of explains how it relates with modern astrophysics. But the belief that at the beginning there was this primordial void of non-existence and existence at the same time is what is said in the Nasadiya Sukta, which you could draw a parallel with the Big Bang Theory's kind of singularity, that singular point that expanded. Um, in the Nasa Diya Sukta, it also mentions as heat. It's I believe it's called tapas, um, as the creative force, and that aligns with the early universe being having extreme temperatures and energy density and expanding as a result. There is mention of cosmic evolution from simple to complex structures in the same way that we went from, I guess, singularity to what we have now. Um, Now, in terms of how it differs from modern science, it believes that there's a role that consciousness has to play in the universe's creation, which is a little different than obviously what modern astrophysics talks about, unless maybe there's some new developments. But from my understanding, that's a little bit of a contradiction or a little bit of a difference over there. And the really interesting thing about the Vedas, or especially this hymn of creation, is that it ends up saying that perhaps even the highest power may not know how the universe came to be, which is kind of like an agnostic, you could say, conclusion in a way. That even like the highest power, God or so on, may not know how the universe came to be, that it was just there. And I think that's really, really interesting because it kind of is very different than when you think of like the traditional depiction of how Hinduism is represented now with like thousands of gods and all these other things. So that was something that I found really interesting. I'll share it with you. There's a bunch of other things like the concept of time. In the Rig Veda, there's like another hymn, and there's like something over there about, and there's another translation there as well, but how that reconciles with modern quantum mechanics and quantum physics. There's something there as well. So it's actually really, really interesting. And even these texts have some of them have been read, translated versions by people like Carl Sagan, who's a famous astrophysicist. So very, very cool, and maybe speaks to that there's probably more that they know at that time than what we give them credit for. Now, speaking specifically of the components of the Vedas, each Veda, there's four Vedas, right? So four, you could say four, you could view them as four books essentially. And there are four components to each book. There's the Samhitas, which is mantras, and rituals. Now, a mantra is basically a sacred sound or prayer that is said on a recurring basis. And with the energy and the way that the sounds are, it's believed to have some sort of consequence, some sort of benefit, a way of praising God, and so on. Um, then there's the Brahmanas, which is the explanation of rituals. So the rituals that are given in the Samhitas, the rituals could be like, for example, there's maybe some sort of fire sacrifice or fire ritual where you like pour this water in and then you I don't know, like bow in front of the fire, whatever that may be. Then there's so many of these different rituals, of which you could even say that some of the modern pujas um are from. So it's explanations of those rituals, and that was primarily meant for the Brahmins, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. Then after that, there's the Aranyakas, and the Aranyakas are kind of known as the Book of the Forest. Now, the Book of the Forest, basically, what that does is it's bridging ritual practice with philosophy. And this is when they start talking a little bit more about like philosophy and spirituality and who am I and how can you pursue this and how can you understand this. So it's kind of meant for people that have reached a point where they've renunciated regular society and they're kind of living out in the forest or in the mountains, and they just want to understand deeper about themselves. Also, there's actually a chat. Are these Vedas from different timelines? So the answer is I believe that they are. And actually, even the components of the Vedas are from different times. So the Samhitas is probably the earliest part, and then the Upanishads are the latest part. So you can kind of see this transition from the ritualistic into the spiritual and philosophical. Now, the final part is the Upanishads. And the Upanishads are basically these core spiritual and philosophical texts. And I kind of view them as similar to, if people have read the Bible, similar to like kind of like Psalms or Song of Solomon, where it's written in a poetic form. And a lot of times there's a series of contradictions given in the text themselves. Like fire and not fire, it is that and is not that, and all these other things. There's all these contradictions given, and all these it's written in a very poetic way, but at its core, it's talking about the core spiritual and philosophy of Hindu thought at that time. Now, the interesting thing about that is like, and I thought a lot about why it was written in that way. So under the general, you could say under the general premise that this was written in, right? At the core, spirituality is an understanding of who you are at your core, right? Now, in these, they believed that you are not your body, you are not your mind. There's something that is more, I guess, deeply rooted within you that is the core of your being. And in some practices, it was called an Atman, which is kind of similar to the view of the soul. And in some, there's something called the Brahman, which is kind of like this, you could say this like infinite, formless, nameless, just that everything is. And it's the Brahman, and everything is kind of like everything is composed of Brahman, essentially. Um, so in that, so that's kind of like that viewpoint. But the thing is, when you, from what I've understood and from sages that have experienced these things and have learned more about like the depth of their consciousness and all these other things, when you reach a point where perhaps there is no seer and seeing, that both of those dualities kind of merge into one, then for you to go from that point, and then let's say you come back into reality and you're like, I want to explain this to the world. I want people to realize, and I want people to be free and understand this core essence of what reality is, or so on, or what you could say enlightenment is, and so on. Converting that from words into words is inherently limiting. And the words themselves would be subservient to the experience. Even imagining, for example, if you take the Brahman, right, which is kind of this like unmanifest everything, sometimes I like to imagine it as kind of this like cosmic energy that like perpetually is like exists throughout the universe. But even that in and of itself is limiting of what it truly is. Any picture that you have of it is limiting of what it truly is. So in the same way, I believe that like for these sages, the spiritual who have reached these points, even this point of enlightenment is so unconstricted that words themselves constrict what that really means. So, another example that I think really like fit in with me is like, imagine describing the color red to someone that can't see, right? Like, how would, no matter what words you use, no matter how else you try to explain it, it's like, it's basically impossible, until they actually see or until they actually witness it. So that's kind of like, I guess the reason why they were written in this way, where it's poetic and there's contradictions amongst each other. Because that's the only way that I can kind of like even attempt to transcend what words themselves may be. So I guess a question that I have for people that like, depending on whatever religion you're practicing, if you're practicing Hinduism, if you're practicing some other religion, or whatever it may be, how do you value how do you value your existing texts or spiritual authority versus your own personal experience? And I'll open the floor for anybody that wants to answer that. And feel free to take a minute to think about it.
I can start us off. I think ultimately in myself, you learn through experience. You can read these things and they're helpful to supplement knowledge, but I think like, you don't know the stove is hot until you touch a stove. And I think certain experiences are just kind of solidified through these kind of spiritual texts. Me personally, like I've read the Bible, read the Quran to some extent, and also like read, some of what we have in Hinduism. And so I like kind of like, and Buddhism as well. And I like kind of pulling different things that I like, and then seeing how that resonates with my current experiences and challenging them. And that's kind of been my way of doing it so far. It's like, how can I relate to this, and what can I disagree with from this? And then as I have those pieces of information from these books or these texts, then as you go through life experiences, and then you can kind of like level up, feel an experience, and then go back to that kind of piece of knowledge and then resonate with it in a different way, because it's kind of like reading a good book, right? It means something different to you when you read it 5 years ago versus when you read it now. So that's what I'd say to that. I think personal experience weighs heavier in my end, but of course, that's different for everyone.
That makes a lot of sense, and thanks for sharing that. Does anybody else want to share? I think maybe in oh, Deemuth, were you supposed about to go?
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think when I so I haven't read any book completely, like maybe partially too. When I hear some lines from the holy books, like Gita, so I think some resonate with like what's happening in general lives, like with mine or like with my friends too. And some of the solutions that that are provided in those tech in those books, uh, I think are helpful, but I'm more skewed towards like what I learned from my personal experiences. Sometimes I think they may be old texts, but this is a new world and it has a new rules now.
Mm.
So, but as I haven't read the complete text, so I may be wrong.
That makes sense. And I think that's an important point that you brought up there with historical context as well, right? Like things can be right in a certain historical era that may not be relevant in the same way anymore. It depends on how
Yeah.
society was function, how people thought as a whole, and so on. So that is definitely a valid point. Something I'd maybe add in terms of how I view things is I think that there's a different type of understanding you get from experience that you definitely get from just like conceptually learning knowledge in the way that like kind of like a memorization style. Like you can logically understand something, but I think there's a
Mm.
different level of understanding, and it's hard for me to describe this, but I just view it as like a feeling type of understanding. When you truly know to the core of yourself that this is like something you have observed in your life.
Mm.
And I think there is something there that's like you also have to be mindful of because you can definitely draw the wrong conclusions as well, right? You can take an incident and completely decide that, you know what, this is like, this is what reality truly is, and that could be completely wrong. So I think having right discernment there is important as well. So I'd say that like those two things are kind of like what I think about, but I do believe that like, um, the core of personal experience is ultimately the most important thing in any sort of understanding, whether that be even for that, especially for that matter, spiritual understanding. It's not something that someone can just tell you and you can just like all of a sudden become the next Gautam Buddha, right? So that's how I view this. Does anybody have anything else they wanted to share? Okay, cool. I will continue onwards then. Okay. Wonderful. So we just did this. Now the next thing I want to talk about, actually, before I go there, is the core beliefs and systems of this time as well. So Hinduism had evolved a little bit. I know I mentioned about the Upanishads and the philosophical and spiritual elements, but as I told you, the Upanishads came a little bit later in terms of this timeline. Going back over here between 1500 and 500 BC. So the Upanishads were kind of a later part of the timeline, and I'll explain a little bit why, part of the reasons that it came to be a little bit later. But at the beginning of this period, it tended to be very ritualistic because we just had the Samhitas, right? And maybe the Brahmanas. So it was very ritualistic in core nature. Over time, it became more and more like there was more of an uprise of the philosophical and spiritual nature of things. Um, yeah. Now, talking specifically about the Varna system, right? So I did a lot of research into this because I was curious myself, and I honestly didn't know. The Varna system is basically the precursor of the caste system. And it was a division, a social hierarchy in society where people were divided by essentially the types of things that they were doing. And there were four main classes. I want to see where I put this over here. I might have put it a little later. I might have forgotten to write it down, but I'll add this to the slides a little later on. But basically, there's four main parts of the Varna system. So there's the Brahmins, which are the teachers, the priests, the intellectuals of that society. There's the Kshatriyas, which are the warriors, the rulers, and the administrators. The Vaishyas, which are kind of like more of the merchants, the businessmen, farmers, artisans, and then finally the Shudras, which are the laborers. So these were the four initial, you could say, core classes that were created as part of the Varna system. Now, the thing is, when it was first created, it was initially meant to be kind of like this social organizer to deal with all the chaos in society. And it was initially based on personal attributes, which I think is just a fair way of organizing society. But over a period of time, it became increasingly rigid. And then it started to become hereditary in nature with the introduction of something called jatis. So jati is kind of like a hereditary subgroup. So it's by birth, and it's kind of assigning that you belong to this jati because you were a son of this person, they were that, and so on, or a daughter of this person, they were that. Um, so that led to kind of like the decline of the social mobility between the classes and started the evolution towards the caste system. Now, in that, the hierarchy of the Brahmins was definitely the highest, and they definitely took advantage of that as well, under the guise of being the maintainers of religion, right? So now going back to this, the Brahmanas and the Samhitas were almost exclusively for the Brahmins, but even the rest of the Vedas as a whole were kind of gate kept from the rest of population. Um, after a certain point because it was an only Brahmin thing. And a bunch of rules were created about how it wasn't like you're not able to read this and so on. So that was something that happened gradually over a longer period of time, starting from 1000 BCE and extending all the way up until maybe like 600 AD when it got like even more and more rigid over a period of time. Now, talking specifically about the Upanishadic period, the Upanishadic period is, as you said, the Upanishads are kind of like when these were really kind of more of the emphasis. And it's a transition from ritualistic practice of Hinduism to more of like an internal spiritual knowledge. And this is when the emergence of the Hindu philosophical schools happened. Now, core concepts such as karma, reincarnation, the Atman, the Brahman, all these things kind of came to be, and I'll talk more about those in a later class. And this was driven by monks and sages that were really reflecting on the nature of reality, the nature of the self, and so on. Now, there were social and religious dynamics that were at play that really also accelerated this transition. Now, the first one was kind of, I alluded to this just a few minutes ago, is the monopoly of knowledge. So the Brahmins at that time kind of acted as gatekeepers in society, limited the access to the Vedas, and kind of killed the social mobility alongside as well. So the rest of the population was kind of isolated from spiritual experiences. Um, the second thing is because at that time things were very ritualistic in nature, you'd basically go to some sort of Brahmin and get a certain sacrifice or certain something along those lines done, certain yagna done. And those tend to be costly, which also further isolated that thing from spirituality and religion from the masses. It became an like kind of like this only Brahministic thing. And the last thing was as a response to both of those things was was very influential in the rise and the quick adoption of Buddhism and Jainism. And in particular is Buddhism's spiritual focus and kind of a complete rejection of the caste system that influenced Hinduism towards that as well. Now there's actually times before Buddhism even started where Hinduism started going towards this, but over a large period of time, it kind of added more fuel to the fire, essentially. So now talking about philosophical schools, and this is actually like the Upanishadic period in terms of how Hinduism evolved is, to be honest, my favorite. And I have a natural bias towards these things because I naturally am interested in spirituality and philosophy and all these things. But this was for me like the core, you could say like the best, the most interesting part for me. So these schools could be divided into basically two groups. There are these schools that basically don't have that much of a presence anymore, and there's four of them. Nyaya, Purva Mimamsa, Vaishika, and Samkhya. And then the last two are actually relatively more prevalent in modern day as well. So these schools have kind of stood the test of time. So Nyaya is, and I'll go into more detail here, but this is just kind of like a very quick overview. Nyaya believes that everything can be understood through logic and reasoning, and you can reach enlightenment through logic and reasoning. Purva Mimamsa is kind of this ritual-based path to desired outcomes. So Purva Mimamsa is very in line with what the Vedas were, what was being practiced in this part of the Vedas. So very aligned with what the Brahmins were doing. And that school of thought was kind of like a continuation of that. So very ritual based, and just like you have to do things a certain way. And it was also very kind of like you do this, you will get this. So kind of like very exchangey in nature. The third school, which is Vaishika, is actually very interesting. And I don't know a lot about this personally, but from the little bit that I just did my research, it's very aligned with atomic theory that everything at its core is kind of composed with by something called anu, which is essentially representative atoms, and they were believed to be indivisible and so on beyond that point. Um, and your atma or your soul is separate from that physical domain. So that was a third school that was very old, but Samkhya in particular is a very important school. And the reason it's a very important school is basically it's the foundation now for the way that modern Hindu philosophy is understood. So Samkhya is kind of, it was founded by, oh, sorry, someone say something? Okay, I'll continue. But by the way, if anyone has any questions, by all means, feel free to message it in the chat, and then I'll take the time to answer it as well. So now Samkhya was founded by this guy named Sage Kapila. And I think this guy's like actually an absolute legend. Because he basically started looking very inwards and analyzing himself. And some people believe him to be the first known person to transcend the self and really kind of get to the core of who he is as a person. Um, and reach that self-actualization, enlightenment, and so on. And he started what is basically the core of modern philosophy, a modern Hindu philosophy. And this is what I think modern Hindu philosophy is all about, the journey of looking inwards, observing and discovering the self. He wrote some texts which didn't survive, but they basically served as the ideological bed for the remaining two schools. And at a very base level, he kind of explores, believed that there was two things, creation and consciousness. And these things kind of interrelate with each other in the sense that like consciousness is kind of who we are at our core. But creation is kind of all the physical thing that we see. Um, and that's like Prakriti, which is considered creation, can be viewed very similarly to creation, nature, matter, and then Purusha is kind of consciousness. Now, the interesting thing about all these schools up until now is that there's very little emphasis on God. Like, God wasn't really considered much in this situation. There was no like deity worship or anything like that wasn't really as much of a thing in these schools. Also, I think someone's mic is on, so if they could mute it if they unless they need to ask a question, that'd be nice. Thank you. Um, but yes, anyways, so these four schools didn't really have even a core belief on God. And like some of them decided to add something a little bit about God a little later on, but their core original text didn't have anything about this. Now, the yoga school was kind of built on the Samkhya school, and takes the same view of creation and consciousness. But what it did a little differently is it made it a little bit more tangible in terms of practice. So it was more about like, how could you, through meditation, through yoga, and all these other things, reach this state of enlightenment? And the other thing that the yoga school did that they added a little differently is they added a personal deity, which they called Ishvara. And this is just like a personal God, something that's kind of similar to Christian or like other gods in the sense that there's some humanistic element to it. So it's not just this formless nothing thing. And the belief there was that like just meditating or understanding this core nothing, like infinite wisdom or whatever, all this thing is so intangible for the human mind that a personal deity was kind of necessary. Now, I will tell you, yoga is also really interesting because yoga itself means union. So it comes from the word yuj, the Sanskrit word yuj, which means union. And the whole viewpoint there is the union of the body, soul, and mind. So obviously, modern day, you think of yoga and you think of like, going to this like hot yoga studio and then getting your like, I don't know, chai tea latte or something. But there's far more to it. And that practice of like modern of yoga here in the West is what is called hatha yoga. And I will actually talk about this in more detail in one of the classes about what the yoga school believes in, because it personally is something that I've found to like, resonate a lot with in terms of spiritual practices, in terms of like practice of meditation and so on, and like what you can do to kind of like, I guess, be at more a greater peace and so on. Now, and the other thing is this school was also started by someone named Patanjali. Patanjali was a sage, and also he is absolute legend. So like I actually absolutely like love these two guys. They're like actually amazing. But anyways, so he wrote three books. He wrote a book on grammar that was very instrumental at that time. He wrote a book on medicine and Ayurveda, and that book was also very instrumental at that time and kind of compiled all these things together, all the Ayurvedic practices and everything together. And finally, he wrote a book called the Yoga Sutras, which was all about the practice of yoga. And these are one of those books that have kind of stood the test of time. And it's something that I will basically read two or three texts, Hindu texts, again and again. And one of those is the Yoga Sutras. So this was really, really cool. And yeah, and then the final school is Vedanta. Now, Vedanta, the word itself is Ved Anta. So Ved is a reference to the Vedas, and then Anta means end. So end of the Vedas, which is the Upanishads. So it's basically the core of the Upanishadic teachings is the core of Vedanta. And they introduced the concept of the Brahman, which I mentioned earlier, which was kind of like this infinite reality, and then the Atman, which is the soul. And there's different sub schools in Vedanta that have different viewpoints on, is there an individual soul or an individual consciousness that you can separate, or is everything just one consciousness? And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a future lecture as well. But just a very cool thing to know. Now, the Puranic period. The Puranic period after this was more of the rise of the Bhakti movement. Now, Bhakti basically means devotion. And now, in terms of devotion, there is, now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the types of texts a little bit later on. But basically, there were more personal deities and there was more devotional practices amongst them. Now, I think part of the reason that this also happened is as like these viewpoints kind of spread throughout India and more of India was kind of like of ancient India was going through this, local religion and local kind of like worship was integrated with Hinduism, which is why when you go through different regions of India, they all kind of worship different representations, different deities, and so on. Kind of almost like an integration in some sort of point with the local part with what the general Hindu, you could say, viewpoints at that time were. So that kind of all just got added in together. And see, that's actually what makes it really tough to say what does Hinduism stand for, because there's such a diversity of belief and there's such a diversity of even viewpoints because so much is kind of integrated all together. And I'll actually talk a little bit more a little later about what Hinduism actually means. So yeah, anyways, now this was also the time that some very famous texts were written. So if you guys have heard of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, they're basically two ancient texts known as itihasas, or itihasa kind of translates to mean history. And they were compiled during this period. And yeah, so that was a really interesting thing as well. And there was, there's more references to deity worship and all these other things. And there's more complicated deity worship at this point. The Bhagavad Gita was written, which you could also almost say that kind of synthesizes um various spiritual paths, various spiritual schools at that point, and is very much in line with the Upanishads. So you could say that for a lot of people, and even me personally having read it, it feels like a poetic version of a less poetic version of the Upanishads. And then finally, the Puranas were also there, which are folklore. Now, the thing is, there's you can kind of there's some kind of almost like not unsaid, but there's some hierarchy in terms of how people view things. So the Vedas and Upanishads are what are called Shruti. Shruti means of divine origin. It's believed that they come from divine and they're not human written, or they're not human, they're passed down from God essentially. And as a result of that, they're viewed generally as the highest authority in most of these Vedic faiths. Then there's Smriti, which is not of divine origin. It's more era specific. And there's like a lot of different texts there. And some of them are very outdated now. An example being the Manusmriti, which was written, I think, 200 BC or something. And it was also very, very, like, it actually, some of it also enforced um, caste system and added more restrictions and things like that. So there was that whole thing there as well. But then there's obviously like good in there as well, and some spiritual practices and everything. Then the Itihasas, which I talked about, these are kind of, you could say that there's history to them, and then there's also like mysticism to them, or mythology kind of mixed in. And how people view that, some people view it as 100% facts, as this is just how history was. Some people view it as a mix, and some people think that this is just all like essentially folklore, kind of like meant to teach you lessons. And people have different opinions. My personal opinion is that like these things actually probably happened, but not in the same way that it's described. So they're like there's more mythology added around it. But the core event of maybe this Mahabharata, which is this great war, um, I think it happened. But again, people's perceptions. And then Puranas is very much folklore, and it's talking more about like the stories of individual deities, and all that stuff. I think I'm gonna skip this question just because of time. And this is taking a little longer than I thought it would, also first class. So still figuring out the timing and all that stuff, but just want to get through this content. If we have time, we'll come back and talk about this. Okay, now post-Puranic period. First of all, thanks to Dolly and all the image generation models that exist out there for these really sick images, and there's a bunch of them. So yeah, I think they look awesome. This was more of the intensification of the devotion movement, the bhakti movement that I was talking about. Um, and there there are two factions basically of that primary deity, that's kind of viewed as like the supreme deity. And these two factions that kind of split up were Shaivism and Vaishnavism. Now Shaivism is kind of the worship of Shiva, and Vaishnavism is the worship of Vishnu. Now for people that don't have context, basically in Hindu mythology, there's also this viewpoint of the big three, which is Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. And it kind of represents a cycle of creation, preservation, and destruction that is kind of happens all across time. That be whether with societies, maybe even with universes, all these other things. And it's viewed that this cycle is kind of there and they're the representation. But then even in that, there were people that thought that Shiva was like the primary deity, the utmost deity, and then people that thought that Vishnu was the utmost deity. And the interesting thing is there's a little bit more of a split there as well. So the worship of Shiva was kind of, you could say it's almost a little bit more introspective and driven by yogic practices, the meditation, the understanding the core self. So there's a little bit more of that aspect of things in Shaivism. Not to say that it isn't in Vaishnavism, but there's more of that emphasis. And one thing that's very cool is this image over here is actually a depiction of Shiv Shakti. So Shiv is viewed as the masculine, Shakti as the feminine energy, and the intertwining of both is kind of like that's kind of what's represented over here. And that's also a display of Shiva representing consciousness and Shakti representing energy. So there's like kind of that thing at play over there as well. Um, and then the worship of Vishnu tends to be more of a devotion oriented thing. So it's more bhakti oriented in nature. Um, yeah, so then that's that. Then after that, and you could say actually that the bhakti movement overall is very influential in the way that modern Hinduism is practiced. Because at least my perception on this is that the most of how Hinduism is practiced in India nowadays is very oriented around bhakti or devotion, prayer, and all these other things. Now after that period, probably starting in 1500, there was invasions of Muslim rulers from Central Asia that conquered a lot of northern India, and they were called the Mughals. And in that there were times where there was peace, but then times where the religions were kind of against each other, and the Mughals, there was a destruction of temples and texts under the Mughal rule. So that was very much a part of it. And a lot of ancient texts were actually destroyed in that process. So that's something that happened. And then finally, the British invasion also happened. And British occupation of India was really interested because a lot of British moral values, some of them were passed on to India. And it actually was not even like things that we think are like, oh, this is like ancient Hindu. This is the way that things were done in that day, are actually more British values than they are like ancient Hindu values. And an example of that being, for example, the viewpoint of the LGBTQ community was far more liberal in ancient India than what it was after the British came by. And they kind of had more of that like that viewpoint that was integrated into India and into Hindu worship. And you can actually go and see temples where like a lot of these things are depicted that are still there. Another thing that was there was the caste system was also used as a means of control. And there's a couple examples that I found online, and I'm sure there's a lot of them. The censuses were used to categorize people by caste, and administrative jobs were only granted to people of certain castes. And that was kind of done as a mechanism for control as well, because the British were very much kind of divide and conquer as a way of things. So yeah, that was kind of one thing over there as well that kind of influenced Hinduism. And then kind of now talking about the current period, um, Hinduism was introduced to the West. And one of the main proponents, one of the main people that brought it here was Swami Vivekananda. So for my friends that are in New York, there's actually two centers that are Vedantan, Advaita and Vedantan, which is basically what Vivekananda was very responsible for. And back then they used to have, and I think they might still do, but they had these conferences of world religions where different religious leaders from different religions would meet up together, discuss, and so on. And Vivekananda was very involved in that. And as a result, that actually was very influential in Hinduism being introduced to the West. Now, in terms of social reform as well, both Gandhi and Ramakrishna were very instrumental um, in some social reform oriented around Hinduism, right? Gandhi in terms of nonviolence, and Ramakrishna in terms of rejection of the caste system as well. Now, kind of going at a more, I guess, going back a little bit and maybe even asking, where does the word Hindu, what does it mean to be Hindu? What does that word mean? Now, if I go all the way back to this society, this Indus Valley civilization, I don't know if all the rivers are shown over here, but there are seven rivers over here. It's the Indus, Saraswati, Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Sutlej, Bias, and Ravi. I think I may have said one twice. But anyway, so there's seven rivers, seven core rivers. And that entire area, this entire area was known as the Sapt Sindhu. So land of the seven rivers. In an ancient Persian language known as Avesta, this is the first time that the word Hindu was used. Because in that language, the S's were kind of more pronounced as H's. So the words Hapta Hindu were used to represent everyone that was basically living in this Indus Valley civilization, and then later in this Vedic civilization, right? And that actually even goes on to include Buddhists and Jains that were living in that time. And they were all grouped under the term Hindu. And this continued basically well into the 13th century AD. And at that point, Hindustan was basically known as the land of the Hindus. So basically, any indigenous religion that, or not even religion, just people that were living there, anyone that was living here was known as a Hindu. Now, going a little bit more further during the Mughal and colonial period, because there was the introduction of Islam, then there was basically the word Hindu was used to represent the native religions, which would be like Buddhism, Jainism, a Vedic religion, and so on. And the Islam was viewed, Islam and Christianity were viewed separately naturally. And then finally, starting in the late 1800s, was when it started referring to basically the religious beliefs of people that essentially are view the Vedas as the primary authority in some way or form. So that's basically what modern Hinduism, in a sense, is more referring to nowadays. And that's why it's often known as the Vedic religion or Sanatan Dharma or so on. Now, a lot of times people mention that Hinduism is like a way of life, it's not a religion. And this is maybe my personal opinion, but I do think that Hinduism is a religion, or you could say almost like a dharma, a practice, a path of righteousness. But because there's that limitation in the original context, it wasn't a religion, right? It was just kind of a society. But now, in the context that it's used in, I believe that it is still a religion or a path of righteousness, but there's a high degree of plurality of thought that's still allowed. And I think that's what's one of the things that are really, really cool about it. And another way, in my opinion, of referring to it as like Sanatan Dharma or Vedic Dharma or anything like that would be another way of referring those things. And part of the reason that there's such a diversity also is that there is no central figure in, you could say, the Vedic schools that's like, this is the one person that created it. Like in Buddhism, there was Gautam Buddha. In Christianity, there was Jesus and so on. And like, there were all these specific characters, specific people that were responsible for creating an individual religion. Everybody knows it's them. But in Hinduism, there's nothing like that. And especially in terms of the philosophy, you can kind of just view it as in the ancient times, sages had questions about who the self was, and they introspected very deeply and understood who the self was. And that is kind of where a lot of Hindu philosophy, and especially that translates into modern day as well, is kind of from. So now, in terms of, I kind of summarize what my core tenets of Hinduism are. And I think these things are very common for the most part amongst the Vedic religion. And the first one is that you're not just your body and your mind, there's something deeper to you, and deeper around you as well that exists. It may be the Brahman, it might be consciousness versus creation, but there's like you're just not your body and your mind. Now, in respect to this, the purpose of this journey is to understand the self at your core and be free. Now, given that there was going back over here, there were all these different schools, all these different opinions of like how you can do this, right? There are many frameworks that lead you to a true understanding of yourself. And I think part of the reason that there's so many frameworks is kind of what I was talking about earlier, that like when you see something as core, as fundamental as like you're kind of like almost like witnessing, like you have transcended yourself and are witnessing something beyond that. There's no seer, there's no observer. It's very hard to frame that. And as a result, many people will have many different perspectives and ways of sharing that. But one thing that I think is very common amongst paths, especially the paths that exist modern day, are that all of them require some degree of selflessness and surrender. And I don't think when I say surrender, I don't mean that you just give up everything, you go meditate in the mountains, give up your life away. But surrender also means surrender of emotions, surrender of attachment, and all those things kind of are at play. So that's what I think are my core tenets of Hinduism. And yes, so I think that's all I had in terms of this for today. Um, I'm gonna stop the